right. And Alex, you can still see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Derek.
Awesome. Alrighty. Alright. So, as a Jules Verne nut, I feel like I'm almost automatically a translation nut. Verne started me kind of down that road, but been from various other avenues, I've kind of been led in any kind of other directions. Somehow, a few years ago, I stumbled upon this guy on YouTube named Tim Wildsmith. He reviews Bibles. And Bibles, yeah. And, while the majority of the time he's talking about the quality of the leather used on the cover, the page gilding, or all that stuff, he also goes into the different translations. And, for the Bible, there's even more than Jules Verne. Like, there's plenty to choose from. And he wrote a book in 2024 called Bible Translations for Everyone, where he discusses the history of different Bible translations and how each one stands out from all the others. Through this book and different videos he's made on the topic, I was acquainted with the so-called Bible translation spectrum, which categorizes translations based on formal equivalence versus dynamic or functional equivalence. And while those terms were initially unfamiliar to me, I learned formal equivalence refers to the more word-for-word style, while functional equivalence errs more on the side of understanding of a thought. And, that got me thinking and made sense to me based on my Spanish classes in school. The example in my head was like the phrase learned in the first week of Spanish class, ¿Cómo te llamas? Right? Taken literally or word for word, it's how yourself you call. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? If we rearrange the words a bit, they come to the more understandable yet archaic sounding, how do you call yourself? But then on the more functional equivalent side, you end up with, what is your name? And obviously that's more of the way we say it in English. So if we take a look at our Bible translation spectrum, we see that the King James Version, the old translation everybody knows, right, is one of the more literal or word-for-word translations, while the more functional equivalents, newer entries include the New International Version and the New Living Translation. And that's obviously just a few examples. There are many translations, both old and new, that fall into either of those camps or somewhere in the middle. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with Jules Verne? Well, in mulling over this Bible translation spectrum, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to categorize some of the translations, or in my opinion, even more interestingly, some of the translators of Verne on a similar spectrum, to gain an idea of the translations of multiple people on one chart. So that is what I'll aim to do here. Not very good at French, but I'll try my best. Before I begin, just want to add, I'm not equating Verne's works or translations thereof with Holy Scripture. I just think this is an interesting analytical tool that we can use for a different perspective. So I recently read The Meteor Hunt and the Chase of the Golden Meteor side by side to appreciate the difference between Jules Verne's original manuscript and his son's edited version. I even made up a document showing the differences between the two, which chapters in one correspond to which chapters in the other, and so on. And Alex, I'll email this to you so you can see it as well.
Oh,
Can't really show that super well. My two favorite takeaways from doing that were minor changes that didn't affect the story, but made the writer, or in this case the editor's voice heard. In chapter 1, Michel states that Judge Proth was a bachelor, a proof of his wisdom, whereas Jules said he led the untroubled existence of a bachelor. Or when Michel said that people that get married are generally a trifle mad. And Jules just remarks at the ease of the gist of the piece, pronouncing you man and wife. And my favorite was in chapter 7 of each book, where they each make the point that a character won't shut up by saying the President of the United States would have the same trouble trying to shut up an angel from God when Jesus returns. But Jules uses the angel Gabriel, his middle name, and Michel uses Michael. But enough about the difference between the two books from a written perspective. How about the translation philosophies? Well, when a formerly married couple meet up later in the book, Michel's version, translated by Frederick Lawton, says, a few difficulties and anxieties are in keeping before marriage. Matches that are made too easily risk being unmade with the same facility. where Jules' version, translated by Walter James Miller and Frederick Paul Walter, says, "A few hardships, problems, and anxieties are to be expected before a wedding. When getting married is too easy, there's an actual risk of the marriage going sour." Just from those, you can see that the first one kind of fairly straightforward, but the Walters version seems to kind of expand on it a bit and use modern English sayings to make the point. This leads me to believe that, assuming the source text of that quote was the same for both translations, then the Walters err more on the side of functional equivalence, while Lawton errs more on the formal side. I could probably find more quotes to make my point, but I don't think I really need to, as the introduction to Walters' version clearly states their translation philosophy. Our text aims not only for accuracy and fidelity, it aims also for a reader-friendly style. Meter can be classed as a comic novel, and since its characters hail mainly from the United States, we've used American colloquialisms to approximate the humor, tone, and effect of the original French. In the same vein, we've converted Verne's francs to dollars and his metric figures to U.S. weights and measures. As for the repetitious use of full names, for the sake of naturalness and variety, we occasionally abbreviate them to first or last name only. So let's go ahead and start our new chart with these two translators, Lawton more on the formal side and the Walters more on the functional. And don't worry, I'll come back to both of the Walters individually a little bit later. Next, we'll see what Alex thinks of this. I thought I'd examine another of his translations. A translation he did of Rover the Conqueror was released in 2017, and as you can see, I'm comparing the opening passage with the Samson Lowe translation as well as the original French text. We see right off the bat, both the source text and Alex's translation mention the 2 pistol shots, but Samson Lowe is not specific. Next, Lowe uses yards as a stand-in for paces. Not a significant change, but a change anyway. Once again, while stating that both men are fine, Alex's is much more in line with a simple reading of the French, where the Samson Lowe seems to abridge this line. We'll come back to that later. The most significant change so far is when the Samson Lowe contends it is on the left side where all this happens, when the French clearly states right, which Alex also puts down. Alex adds Niagara at the end of the sentence there for clarity. It's not perfectly word for word, but warranted, I think. Now, while the many French speakers here can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems Samson Lowe is more literal on this next line, but Alex is more so the line after that. Or interestingly, Samson Lowe leaves off the no while settling for more flowery language. The biggest change in the next line is Samson Lowe calling the witnesses seconds, I'm assuming referring to the dueling rules, but not exactly what Jules has written down. Alex continues to be more literal than the Samson Lowe translator when he renders cattle as livestock, where Samson Lowe says, in the interests of the milk trade, and the next line where Lowe renders lunch as breakfast. Though I've heard that's a little bit up in the air. That can kind of go either way. So nothing, goes 100% literally from one language into another. But the things Lowe adds, subtracts, or changes seem to be much more significant and more, let's say it the way we want to, than Alex's more faithful style, at least to my mind. And in talking with Alex, he brought up to my attention another important factor in the faithfulness category. Kind of as Reggie was saying, where he added words to make it clear to an English-speaking audience the gender of a character, since we don't really have any gendered words in English. So I'd place Alex somewhere near the middle of our spectrum, and Lowe's translation a little more to the right. Though let's continue to looking into that one, as I think that one may move a bit. Taking a look at Alex's introduction to his Robert translation, he shows the difference between his translation and the other two that came before it. This is the same portion of each of those books. Just as you can see, just by the relative lengths, Alex has translated, while the other two may not be able to use that term. They both cut out a lot, and as Alex mentions, the Lowe version even breaks up chapters and other weird edits. To me, this puts Lowe even further on the right of our spectrum, going into the paraphrase area. Though I don't know if that's even applicable with all the stuff that's left out. Kind of going back to Bibles for a second, Eugene Peterson's The Message Bible seems to be longer than the original, as it tries to flesh out things in modern-day English, where this Lowe translation is just abridging. So, off our spectrum it goes. Moving on, I found a wonderful article on Verniana, and we'll have to talk about that in the meeting because can't get to that right now. Where Frederick Paul Walter and William Butcher examined each other's translations. While Walter's main reason for looking at Butcher's translation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas was the new and edited Folio Society version of his original 1998 translation from Oxford, which seems to be a little more free and colloquial than the original, Walter does a good job giving an overview of Butcher's translation style, both for scholarly editions and reading ones. Whether for stylistic reasons or to bring out Verne's French language in-jokes, Butcher tends to shy away from a literal structure, adding in current idioms and shortening exclamations or dialogue. Walter concludes this way of translating makes the translation enjoyable and easy reading. And I think that anyone who's read his translations can't help but agree with that. Since this presentation attempts to be semi-scholarly, I'll place Butcher on our spectrum, based on his scholarly Oxford editions, which I think are more widespread and read than the folio versions, and put him edging on to the dynamic side of the Vernian translators. Now, while not as in-depth, Walter also gives a little insight into both Kieran O'Driscoll and Sophie Lewis, putting them up against Butcher's work to see the differences. Based on his analysis, I'd compare O'Driscoll to our Message Bible that I was talking about earlier, as he takes the text and expands on it for clarity's sake, to ensure we get the point, to quote Walter. On the other hand, Lewis seems to be roughly analogous to something like the New King James Version, without all the Old English language, but very literal, while still being readable. Now, I promised we'd come back to Frederick Paul Walter's philosophy, and William Butcher, while much more concise, talked about one of Walter's 20,000 Leagues translations in this article as well. One thing he says that is very relevant for our study today is that Walter's translation strikes a near-perfect balance between Mercier-style convolutions and the over-modernized, unliterary, and informal style that has marked many previous attempts, between the archaic and the anachronistic, between the obscure and the over-amplified. He then adds in some of the word choices made, where both more American ways of saying things are used, as well as some older, more classical European ways as well. Another quote I think sums up my experience with Walter's translations is that a decision is made to systematically use contracted forms, even for the formalist Third Speaking Council. I'll admit I haven't read any of Walter's solo versions of 20,000 Leagues, just the combined one he did with the other Walter, but what I have read of him, as well as what an Amazon comment for the Sphinx of the Ice Realm says, is that he generally translates into 20th century American colloquialism. So while not expanding quite like O'Driscoll, I think he belongs on the right side of our spectrum. Now, to complete my teaser from earlier, let's look into Walter James Miller through his translation of From the Earth to the Moon. I'll be looking at the section where Barbicane announces the plan he has come up with. We see on, this is page 13 of the Gramercy edition, compared with the French. Everyone's trying to settle all the voices down so they can hear Barbicane's penultimate proposal. Well, the first line here follows the meaning of the sentence. Listen, listen, therefore quiet was exclaimed on all sides, or thereabouts, is not perfectly translated, literally, by Miller. I'll interject here to say that my translations are very literal, both as a means of comparison to see what Verne actually wrote, but also because my own French is very lacking, so I tend to go word by word. Now, from my understanding, from this point on, Miller gets more and more literal, with a few rearranged words, but nothing major in the next line. And past that point, only figures of speech are translated slightly differently, more how we'd say it in English. Like down here, you are not ignorant, are you not, of the general fact that the force of resistance of cannon and the expansive power of the powder is unlimited? Yes. This way of translating tracks well with what Anastasia told me after working on her edition that comes out later this month, that Miller stays quite close insofar as he can, although, of course, idiomatic expressions pose a challenge. And that's kind of finishing out that page there. So, therefore, I'll add Miller to our list a little more to the left, not as literal as Sophie Lewis, but more so than Butcher. From looking at them both, I think he is slightly more literal than Alex, so I'll put him just to the left. And now for the book that starred me on the Jules Verne train, The Mysterious Island. I had heard of Verne before, usually in reference to 20,000 Leagues or Journey to the Center of the Earth, But the day I actually went looking for one of his books at the library, I stumbled upon The Mysterious Island, and that was the only one I saw on the shelf, though I eventually found others in the sci-fi section. We can debate whether that's where they should be, but... Now, the first one I read was the Jordan Stump translation. Obviously, I liked it, since I'm still reading Verne today. And we'll compare Stump's approach with that of Sidney Kravitz. Starting in part 3, when the castaways close in on the pivotal moment of this whole story, the first face-to-face with their benefactor, we see the French reads, "At the center of the lake, a long, fusiform object floated at the surface of the waters, silent, immobile." Besides his translation of fusiform into spindle-shaped, Kravitz follows my literal translation very closely, while Stump shortens the longer description, though keeping the message and fusiform intact. Though I'm not really sure who ever uses the word fusiform. I think the only time I've heard it is in Verne. But continuing on, Kravitz transcribes into English the next sentence as well, changing very little compared with the French, while Stump again shortens the next sentence, even though no meaning is lost. While Kravitz keeps going with the form we've seen, the next sentence is actually expanded on by Stump to provide some clarity. This continues in the next paragraph, with the slight difference that Kravitz takes bra, however you pronounce that, to be plural, and Stump to be singular. We continue, where both translations are essentially literal for the next few dialogues and sentences, other than Stump adding some interjections for clarity and using more nautical terms for parts of a ship than does Kravitz, while still keeping close to the original text, and actually translating this dialogue slightly more literally than Kravitz in that section. Kravitz keeps the sentence structure while the castaways are entering the submarine, and from then on out, Stump seems freer, expressing the text more from an American mindset of language. Darek Powell confirms this analysis in a review of both editions, stating that Stump's sometimes has a more consciously literary tone. Kravitz is a little more faithful to Verne's inner sequences and structures, yet Stump may sometimes phrase more elegantly. Based on this evidence, and again, that's finishing out the page there, based on this evidence, I would put Kravitz to the right of Sophie Lewis, with his literal rendering that mirrors exclamations and dialogue directly from the French, and Stump between Alex and Darek Powell, roughly in the same area as William Butcher, as he is more fluid in sentence structure than Alex, but not as into the colloquialisms as Walter. I could continue going on for a while, but I figure I'll start winding down, and I'll finish up with Edward Baxter. I never had the chance to meet him, unfortunately, but I've enjoyed reading several of his translations, my favorite so far being The Count of Chantilly. I'll analyze it based on the end of Chapter 7, which is a turning point in the story. From the French, we read, "Therefore you speak, Mr. Tregelon, you speak," said the Count. "Mr. Count," responded the knight, "my sister was thrown into the prisons of Quimper. Desperate, I ran to Paris, and after long entreaties obtained her pardon from Couthon, to whom my family had once rendered service." Baxter follows the sentence structure fairly closely, but renders the text into more normal English than I did. One main difference is his keeping of the titles in the original French, not translating them, which is actually very, very literal translating, as you're keeping the original words, but it also keeps a flavor of the story, since the story occurs in France. Baxter finishes out the page in much the same vein, only dropping the second O from the Count as redundant. Thenceforth, he diverges a bit more from the text, as a little rendering of the next paragraph would not make much sense in English. Trust me, I tried. But still follows the sentence structure fairly closely, with the last two lines here going back to a more literal rendering. Based on Baxter's ability to be less literal when he needs to be, but his desire, seen here, to maintain the French flavor of the literature, I'd place him just slightly to the left of Alex, as he seems to me to be just a touch more literal. And while not spelling it out specifically, Baxter himself seems to confirm this middle-of-the-road approach in a short article on translating in the Jules Verne Encyclopedia, appropriately titled "The Tribulations of a Translator of Jules Verne." In this piece, Baxter recounts the difficulty moving a story from French to English, showing examples of times where one has to choose between a literal translation or understanding of the nuances in writing style. detailing with the issues with French words having gender, as Alex did above, or dealing with out-of-date references and just wrong information. Baxter doesn't seem inclined towards interlinear explanations, as O'Driscoll does, or strict word-for-word style, even when the text makes that difficult. So by his own explanation, he seems to be best suited at the center of the spectrum. So here we're left with my decisions I made in my research conglomerating in this interesting chart. I'm sure one of you translators could make a better job comparing these translations to figure out if I place neighboring ones on the right side of each other or not. I do think, however, that this gives a good general idea of where the translators sit and where their translation philosophy lies. And to you who do translate, if you want to add yourself to this chart or move yourself, let me know and I'll update my analysis, since no one is better knowing than the people who are actually doing the work. But I think all of this analysis leads to a big question. What is a good translation? Is it one that is formally word for word, or one that positions itself as dynamic? Jordan Stump, in his preface to the Modern Library version of The Mysterious Island, says, "I have done here what any translator does. I have tried to offer the American reader an experience as similar as possible to my own experience of the original work. But this is no simple thing. Indeed, it is a very complicated thing. And a reader who compares my translation to Kingston's will find not that mine simply hews more closely to Verne's text than his, nor that it departs from Verne's text more boldly, but that it sometimes hews and sometimes departs. For fidelity is a strange and labyrinthine undertaking. Such are the decisions translators are called upon to make. We all want to be faithful, but faithful to what? To each word? To the text as a whole? To the reader? To all of them at once, preferably. No simple thing. Again." And that's it.